welcome, bienvenidos, bienvenidas, bienvenidas. So this presentation is taking place in this multilingual education class, yes, but we're also recording and broadcasting, and we're going to be sharing through the Transborder Scholar Collaborative. So a little bit about the Transborder Scholar Collaborative. The Transborder Scholar Collaborative is dedicated to the social justice of Transfronterizx students in throughout the education pipeline through liberatory methodologies. We do this through photo voice, we do this through autoethnography, and also the collaborative is composed of educators, scholars, of course, professors, students that have that transborder experience as well. And part of the Transborder Scholar Collaborative is a teaching and learning along the U.S. Mexico borderlands speaker series, where we bring speakers from along the borderlands that are dedicated to the social justice of students, our diverse students at the borderlands. And it is a great honor to have Evelyn here in today's presentation because her work is dedicated to just that. But before we hear about Evelyn, I would like to give her a warm welcome and share a little bit more about who she is. So Evelyn Fernandez is a PhD candidate in linguistics at Stanford University. She received a BA in linguistics and comparative literature from Dartmouth College and an MA in Hispanic linguistics from the University of New Mexico. Her research focuses on language ideologies and variation along the U.S. Mexico borderlands in Spanish and English, primarily how transborder students negotiate competing visions of place through language. Her research interests extend more broadly to popular representations of bilingualism on television and linguistic variations among Latinx speakers through California. So that this is just a brief introduction. We'll get an opportunity to share more about who Evelyn is in her presentation. And Evelyn, like our class, please feel free to also present in English, Spanish, Spanglish. You're more than welcome to do so in this in that way. So, bienvenida.
Okay, thank you so much. It's really such an honor to be here. Yeah, so a little bit about me. I'm from San Diego, Tijuana originally. I grew up in Tijuana and I used to cross the border every day to go to school in San Diego. So I was always just very fascinated by language. It's such an important part of growing up here. So anyways, that's how kind of why I got into linguistics. But I guess maybe a little bit to add to that, I was kind of, when I took my first sociolinguistics class, I was kind of amazed in a bad way by the lack of research on that go beyond monolingual English-speaking communities, just the lack of, just in terms of research that deals with Latinx speakers. And so part of the reason I've continued, doing the PhD is because my goal is to ensure that our voices are also included in our theories of the scientific and cognitive underpinnings of language. So the research I'm presenting today is actually not on border stuff. That's forthcoming. So hopefully, and I'll get to it at the end, I'll talk a little bit about the kind of work I'm doing now. But this presentation today is work that I've done with colleagues. Will Klopp is a graduate student at Stanford. Lily Clifford, she's a community member, she in Silicon Valley, and she used to be a graduate student at Stanford as well. And then Rob Podesva is a professor at Stanford. Yeah, so the title of my talk is From Prosodic Rhythm to Latinx Identity, the Role of Language Ideologies in Shaping Latinx Englishes Across California. But before diving in, I just kind of wanted to situate this work within the field of sociolinguistics and also lay out the goals of the project. So I'm not an educator. I'm coming from an adjacent field. I do have experience in language classrooms. I've taught Spanish and English, and you're welcome to ask me about that later too if you're curious. But yeah, so what is sociolinguistics? So we're working at the intersection of language and society. And at a very high level, we're interested in the role of the social, whatever that entails in language. That is, what social factors condition language use, and in turn, how do speakers recruit language and social practices? So in this presentation, we focus on the role of language ideologies and race in structuring very fine-grained phonetic information. Specifically, we're interested in this thing called prosodic rhythm variation. So I'm going to demonstrate what the difference is. So rhythm variation refers to, so let's go with syllable timed. A syllable timed rhythm refers to when syllables in a word are about equal length. So Spanish is generally considered a syllable time language. So to explain this, like we can use my name as an example, Evelyn. So in Spanish, you'll see that the slide has Evelyn equals VC. So this refers to, the V refers to vowels, so Evelyn. And the C's are like the consonants. So in Spanish, when I say my name, you kind of get this rhythm, right? Evelyn. It's kind of, they're all kind of equal in length. It's like a staccato type rhythm. But in English, we have a different rhythm. English tends to be more stress time. So when I say my name in English, I go Evelyn. So Evelyn. So what's happening there in English, the first syllable is the stress syllable, so it's longer, which is, I'm representing this with a capital V, and all the other vowels in my name get shortened. So I'm representing this with the smaller V's. Okay, so that's kind of generally the difference that we're looking at. And so this talk is really how our ideologies about language and about our communities can affect very fine-grained phonetic information and ways that we speak. I also want to make a clarification about terminology. So when sociolinguists use the term dialects, it's synonymous with varieties. I think that there's other definitions of dialects that are like problematic, but by dialects, if you see that anywhere in this presentation, it refers to a variety of a language. So for example, Latinx English is a variety of English. It's not like a different language. It's just a variety of one language, or a name language, I guess I should say. Okay, so the first part of this presentation, bear with me, it's gonna be phonetic and quantitative, and we're gonna get into some of these picky details. But the second part is a more qualitative analysis of the actual interviews. So yeah, so like I said, English is typically characterized as a stress time language. Remember that this is where we get variation, right, in the rhythm. However, sociolinguistic research has established that syllable timing is prevalent across varieties. So this pattern has largely been attributed to the influence of syllable timed languages in contact situations. So for example, Spanish in contact with English. In our paper today, we draw on an analysis of prosodic rhythm in a large, diverse speaker sample from California to argue that timing strategies are a product not only of language contact and dialect contact, but also ideologies about ethnic identity and ethnically marked ways of speaking. So before we continue, another kind of terminological issue, which yeah, okay, so decades of work on prosodic rhythm has illustrated that syllable asynchrony, or the tendency for syllables to be roughly equal in duration, is to some degree a myth, even for languages that are commonly described as syllable timed. Even still, so-called syllable timed languages like Spanish tend to exhibit less durational variability for a number of prosodic structures. So Grabe and Lowe 2002 have shown that syllable timed languages exhibit low durational variability, specifically with respect to vowel duration in adjacent syllables. So we can think about this syllable time versus stress time dichotomy. We can think of this as a continuum. So even though you hear me say terms like syllable timed, that just means it's less durational variability that we observe with the vowels, and stress time is a shorthand for referring to less or more durational variability between adjacent vowels. And this will become clear. Yeah. Let's see. Some of this I'm gonna kind of skip, but A nice outcome of viewing prosodic rhythm as this continuous variable is that we've been able to observe how the canonically stress time rhythm pattern of standardized varieties of English has become relatively more syllable timed in situations of language contact. So the influence of substrate language prosody has perhaps been most evident in contact situations with Spanish. So for example, there's been other papers on Mexican American speaking Spanish in Texas that show that there's intermediate between those for English speakers of English and those for Spanish speakers. So their rhythm is somewhere between Spanish and English. There's also been work done with Miami-born Latinx speakers who have the same values, same prosodic rhythm as the Mexican Americans in some other studies. So syllable timing, the point of this slide is to show that syllable timing is not something specific to Spanish. We actually observe it in English. So a broad goal of our project is to further the work of previous studies by describing variation in prosodic rhythm in multi-ethnic communities in California, with the hope of shedding new light on the effects of and also the limits of language and dialect contact. We have several more specific research questions, but today we're just going to focus on the one listed here. We ask whether we observe systematic differences in the prosodic rhythm among Latinx speakers of English in California. Carter et al. Have noted the relatively greater syllable timing of Latinx speakers English across eastern and southern parts of the US, regardless of whether they have Mexican, Cuban, or Puerto Rican heritage. They suggest that syllable timing has become a pan-ethnic feature of Latinx English. While our study supports this claim to an extent, it will also show that there are systematic differences among Latinx speakers of English in California. So this aligns with we've done other studies across California that has shown diversity across Latinx communities in California. So some of the other things that we've looked at, which you're welcome to ask me more later. One of them is lightness of L, which is kind of a funny term. But if you bear with me, if you say a word like alma, go ahead, say alma in Spanish.
Alma.
Yeah. For the L, you'll notice that if you go alma, you'll feel your tongue move forward and your tongue is kind of striking kind of the right behind your teeth, as opposed to if you can say alma. Go ahead and say alma.
Alma.
Yeah, if you go alma, 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 I know this is kind of a funny exercise. You'll actually feel your tongue moving back and forth. So you can go home and try that out. And so that is one way so lightness of L, the light L is the one we say in alma. So it's a feature from Spanish. This is something that's in variation across Latinx speakers. Similarly with the trap vowel, but that refers to trap versus trop. If you've ever thought of a valley girl, oh, that's so Californian. If you notice, my that is going further back in my mouth, so that. But anyways, the point is that other studies in linguistics have said, hey, all of these Latinx people, they all speak Spanish, so they're all going to speak English the same. And part of what we're saying is no, actually there is a rich diversity among just Latinx speakers. And so that's kind of the position that we're coming from. So all the data we'll be discussing today were collected as part of the Voices of California project. So this map shows all of the field sites where data has been collected, as well as the year in which that place was visited. So usually we go to community and we carry out a set of tasks with each participant, but for today, we're only considering the sociolinguistic interviews. So this is just a conversation with one of the interviewers. So there's currently over 900 interviews in the corpus, with on average over 100 interviews from each field site. And so as part of this, one of the tasks that they do is they fill out a demographic questionnaire, and they don't get a multiple choice. They get blanks and they can identify however they would like. So today we're reporting on an analysis of 416 of the interviews. So these are the ones that have been transcribed thus far. And among the interviewees, gender is slightly skewed towards cisgender women. There was only one non-binary speaker. And interviewees were diverse in terms of educational attainment, and importantly for our purposes today, race and ethnicity. So the figure on the right shows the counts for a variety of ethno-racial groups that as they were self-identified. While the largest group of speakers was white, there is considerable number of speakers in each group, especially Latinx speakers. Since sociolinguists have only begun to examine how multiracial speakers use language to construct race and ethnicity, we have placed multiracial and multi-ethnic speakers in their own groups for our study. So all of these interviews were transcribed by hand, and then the transcription is aligned to the audio. And that's kind of how we're able to get our data. So if you take a word like cat, the word cat has like 3 sounds in it. It will be aligned to the audio such that we can extract values for the vowel in cat, so the a in cat. So yeah, so then we use the scary equation, which I'll like break down for you to kind of get the values for prosodic rhythm. So the value, the thing that we're kind of measuring is it's called NPVI, and this is a normalized value. And so you calculate the difference in vowel. So the way this works, remember how I had my name, Evelyn, and the V's were the vowels in my name and the C's were the consonants in my name. So to calculate NPVI, what you do is you take one vowel, so like the one in red here, you take the duration, so how long it is, and then you take the duration of the next vowel. And so you subtract those 2 numbers, you get the difference between those, and you divide it by the average. So basically, you take the first quotient and then you do the same thing for like the next 2 vowels. And you keep going until you get through like the whole recording. And so you sum up all of the quotients and divide them by all of the vowel pairs. And so a smaller number will be indicative of less durational variability. So there's less variability, so the syllables are more the same. So this is indicative of syllable timing, while a large number will be indicative of stress timing, right? Because it's more variable. Okay, so I'll go a little bit quickly through this part. So we automatically calculated a vocalic NPVI for each speaker. I think probably for us, the important idea is to just know that a value that falls between 55 to like 60 something is more syllable timed. So it's more Spanish-like. And if a value falls between like 70 and above in this study, it's more English-like, it's more stress timed. So to analyze our data, we first fitted a fixed effects linear regression model to all speakers. And so before running the model, we made several exclusions. So individuals with NPVI, so this is like the normalized PVI values below 30, were defined as outliers and they were removed from the analysis. Yeah, and so then we had a number of other exclusions, but I'm just going to go ahead and kind of skip to the results across the board, and then yeah, we can get to some of the more interesting things. Okay, so year of birth was, so once we ran our like linear regression models, we found that year of birth was significant with a negative coefficient. So this indicates that younger speakers have lower PVIs, so they're more syllable timed. And this change in apparent time was relatively consistent across, this is all of the speakers in the sample. For education, the only significant comparison was between groups 4 and 5. So these are people with college degrees, graduate degrees. And so basically, the higher level of education, the more syllable timed you were. Okay, but more central to our study was the analysis of PVI between members of different ethno-racial categories. Because monoracial white speakers formed by far the largest portion of the sample and were characterized by relatively average PVI values, that group acted as our reference level. Yeah, so comparatively, the monoracial African-American group had significantly higher PVI, so they were more stress timed. Meanwhile, the multiracial and monoracial Latinx groups both had significantly lower PVI values, indicating greater syllable timing. Yeah, so I think, let's see. Yeah, I think kind of like the main takeaway here is that Latinx speakers were just more syllable time compared to everyone else in the sample. And so the astounding question that remains is, why do these differences exist? Why is it that Latinx speakers, when you compare them to everyone else in California, are more syllable timed? And a very popular explanation in the literature has been to appeal to phonological transfer from Spanish. So all that to say, the natural intuition here is that because Spanish is in general more syllable timed than American English tends to be, speakers with strong Spanish experience should be more likely to produce English with lower PVI or with greater syllable timing. So it is in fact the case that rhythmic differences between speakers of Latinx varieties of English and speakers of non-Latinx varieties is primarily the influence of Spanish as a substrate language. It follows that Spanish-English bilinguals should be more syllable timed than English monolinguals, and that's what we tested next. So we ran like a second linear regression model consisting of just the Latinx speakers in the sample from two predominantly Latinx field sites in our data, so Bakersfield and Salinas. So for reference, 29 out of 75 participants from Bakersfield identified as Latinx, so 53%, and 45 out of our 49 subjects from Salinas identified as Latinx. So our dependent variable was again vocalic and PVI, and then you can see there the model that we ran. Yeah, so, okay, I know there was a lot, but if you remember nothing else from this talk, this is the one of the slides I would like you to remember, because it's quite striking when you understand what's happening here. So basically, we found that there was this difference between Latinx and non-Latinx speakers across California. And so then when we just looked at Latinx speakers, the prediction in the literature is like, oh, because all of these people are Spanish speakers, or not even Spanish speakers, but like because there's this association between Spanish and Latinx, even when someone is, the prediction is that everyone who is bilingual is gonna be more syllable timed. So the number along that y-axis is gonna be closer to 50. And everyone who's monolingual is gonna be more stress timed or more English-like, so that number is gonna be higher. But what we found is that bilingualism was not a predictor of this. What was more interesting is like the field sites themselves were significantly different. Let's see. So within each of both like Bakersfield and Salinas, the monolingual and bilingual speakers had the same NPVI values. So in general, this result suggests that rhythmic tendencies are not structured by bilingualism and therefore unlikely to be the result of language transfer. The strong relationship, on the other hand, between field site and NPVI suggests that rhythmic properties may live as a socially meaningful variable, the use of which hinges on language ideologies prevalent within different communities. So in other words, what matters is the community of study and what people think and how they view, and that's what I'll turn to next. One maybe like note here, another reason why this matters is that, and this may be of interest to you guys too as educators, is that a common kind of misunderstanding is that when someone is a native speaker of Latinx English, sometimes they're confused as people take them to be what we call an L2 English speaker, so L2 second language speaker of English. So for example, if you're interested at all in the relationship between like education and like linguistic anthropology, Jonathan Rosa has this really great book called Looking Like a Language, Sounding Like a Race, Ratio-Linguistic Ideologies and the Learning of Latinidad. And what he does in that book is he studies this group of students in Chicago who grew up in Chicago and they speak Latinx English, and the adults in the community think of them like, well, they don't speak Spanish and they don't speak English, and don't recognize that these students do speak English fluently. So this is one of the reasons why this slide is important, because even in my fieldwork now, the work I'm doing now with and interviewing different people in San Diego and Tijuana, people often do tell me, they're like, oh, fulanito, like he grew up in San Diego, he doesn't speak Spanish, but he also doesn't speak English. So one thing, like, I do want to clarify is that Latinx English is a valid variety of English. Okay, so to begin the discussion of our results, we think it would be useful to think of syllable timing as a resource for identity construction. Since syllable timing is a property of Spanish and stress timing is a property of standardized varieties of English, then syllable timing might be seen as an index of Latinx identity. I do want to make another kind of clarification. So on the top right, you see this like box that says more syllable time, more Latinx, and the other one, more stress time, less Latinx. This refers to an index, which is a term from semiotics, from linguistic anthropology. So maybe like a good example is like my English is more stress timed, but that doesn't mean that like I'm somehow less Latinx. It's just an index. So an index is well, I don't want to get too much into semiotics, but it's basically an index. It's kind of like an indication of something. So for example, the example people use is like a footprint is indexes or points to the presence that a foot exists. Which I know sounds kind of funny. A better example is probably like we get this a lot. A lot of times language is a lot like fashion. Even right now, like what I'm wearing, I'm wearing this like nice kind of top. You can't tell, but I'm wearing earrings. I'm wearing these glasses, and all of these items that I'm wearing have some kind of indexable value. I don't have a PhD yet, but I do have masters, right? So I'm trying to be like more professional sounding. My glasses might be indexical of like the frames I pick might indicate something about like my nerdiness. I don't know. There's like a million things. But I do want to clarify that just because someone has more stress timed English, it doesn't mean that they're less Latinx. This refers to an index. Okay. So this association between syllable timing and Latinx identity plays out at different levels of representation. In other words, it's fractally recursive, to use Irvine and Gall's 2000 terminology. And again, if you're interested in linguistic anthropology, these are really great places to start. So our data show that among English speakers, Latinx identified speakers exhibit more syllable timing than those who identify with other ethnic groups. So again, this first bar refers to like just Latinx versus non-Latinx. But we can take this opposition and replicate it again because this is fractally recursive. So the same opposition can be seen among Latinx speakers across the state. For example, speakers from Salinas, a predominantly Latinx community where Latinx identity and the Spanish language are valorized, exhibit more syllable timing than speakers from Bakersfield. While we see quantitative differences across the communities of Salinas and Bakersfield, the same opposition between more versus less overt affiliation with Latinx identity and Latinx ways of speaking differentiate individuals within communities. Okay, so to better understand how this fractal recursion emerges in interaction, let's turn now to the interviews themselves. The content of these interviews demonstrates how ideologies regarding Latinx identity and English-Spanish bilingualism further structure prosodic rhythm patterns. So regarding the more stress time speakers, those with the highest NPVI values generally viewed standard varieties of English as symbols of upward mobility and strove to dispel myths associated with Latinx speakers. In contrast, more syllable time speakers, that is, the lowest NPVI values, viewed Spanish and Latinx varieties of English as a means of combating white privilege and expressed a desire to remain in the predominantly Latinx communities. In other words, when we consider the perspectives shared by bilingual speakers across the corpus, we find that language contact between Spanish and English is not the sole factor driving timing strategies. Rather, how speakers position themselves within a community and their views on Latinx ways of speaking, Latinx ways of being play an active role in structuring rhythm patterns. California Latinx speakers by no means share the same ideologies, and this is reflected both in their sociolinguistic interviews and resulting NPVI values. So to demonstrate how stark this difference is in ideologies, how stark this difference in ideologies can be, let's look at two speakers from Sacramento. So the first speaker has a higher NPVI value, and then she clearly, or they clearly express in the interview that, she says, I wanted to get on the record that fact that not all people with a Spanish surname have an accent. I think if you were to talk to me over the phone or listen to my voice, you wouldn't be able to tell my ethnicity, and I wanted to dispel those stereotypes. Most of the time when people do these studies, people of color are often excluded, and I wanted to be part of that particular voice. Okay, meanwhile, the second speaker, who has a low NPVI value, so they're more syllable timed, is coming to terms with what they describe as their racial autobiography. And they say, I see myself not necessarily Mexican American. Mostly, I look at it just as my culture. What do I closely identify with? What resonates me? And it's Mexican culture. And then at the end, but if it came down to it, that's what I would identify myself as. And so this person elsewhere in the interview, they're very passionate about combating racial inequity and white privilege. So the contrast in language ideologies is especially apparent when we compare Bakersfield and Salinas. In line with previous research on Voices of California data, Latinx speakers in Bakersfield constitute a sizable minority and consequently face pressure to accommodate to majority language patterns. Racial tensions are at the forefront of these interviews, as with this first example. When I started high school, I don't know why I felt that because of me being Puerto Rican, that the only thing that I could do in high school was take wood shop or metal shop. Typewriters or anything like that, that was for the white kids. That only the white kids could do that. We see here the way in which race structures life chances. The association between typewriters and white kids is especially notable since it illustrates how standard varieties of English are taken up as symbols of social mobility. Furthermore, Spanish English bilingualism is not necessarily seen in this community as an asset in the workforce, as evident in the second quote. It's funny, I never tried to apply it out in the workforce because I didn't think nothing of it. So taken all together, Bakersfield Latinx speakers face a strong socioeconomic pressure to accommodate to majority patterns, resulting in more stress time speech even for bilingual speakers. Meanwhile, Latinx speakers are the majority in Salinas. Salinas is also the birthplace of the labor and civil rights movement led by Cesar Chavez, and many interviewees celebrated the community's rich Latinx history. This results in a very different set of experiences for Latinx speakers. For example, compare our previous Bakersfield interview with how this first speaker experienced race in education. She says, growing up, I always thought everybody was Mexican. So just because they looked like me or my family, and I was like, oh, they're probably Mexican too. I didn't really become aware of race until I got to college. Once in college, it's also fun to note, she joined an all-Latina sorority with a focus on academics and service. Let's see. In contrast to Bakersfield, throughout the Salinas interviews, speakers repeatedly cite the prevalence of Spanish in the community. In the second quote, the speaker is describing how their parents can get by without speaking English. They say, in Salinas, you can practically get by your whole life without having to speak English, You can just speak Spanish your whole life. This is largely indicative of the value placed on Spanish and also Latinx community members. Altogether, Salinas Latinx speakers hold a largely positive view of bilingualism and Latinx varieties of English, resulting in more syllable timed speech. So to conclude, we note that language contact between English and Spanish and dialect contact between Latinx and non-Latinx varieties of English influence prosodic rhythm in California English. Importantly, prosodic rhythm is also influenced by speakers' language ideologies and the ways that they orient to Latinx identity and Latinx ways of speaking. Syllable timing is the resource for constructing Latinx identity. a resource that Latinx speakers can use not only to differentiate themselves from non-Latinx speakers, but also to construct varying affiliations with Latinx identity. So in future work, we plan to examine other measures of durational variability and rhythm more generally. And we plan to investigate intra-speaker rhythm variation to better understand how prosodic rhythm might be used as a dynamic resource for constructing ethnicity. So basically how even one speaker can vary over the course of an interaction. So today I presented this work, but there's a lot of people to thank. First, the interactional sociophonetics laboratory members, Stanford, and also, like I said, this is part of a much larger project that's been going on for years, and there's a lot of interviewees and researchers, and also again to like my co-authors. And then I'll end on this note. So so now I'm currently in San Diego, and I'm doing like my dissertation fieldwork. So my project has nothing to do with prosodic rhythm or any of that. It's quite different. But if you notice, that place holds a very important role in this, just like the history of a community. In this case, it was Salinas and Bakersfield. And so part of what my work is doing is like bringing that attention to the San Diego-Tijuana border. And I'm really interested in speaking with college students about how they view the San Diego-Tijuana region, what they think about each city, but also just like what it's like to be a college student who commutes. So anyways, if you guys know of anyone in San Diego-Tijuana, feel free to share my study. So these ads advertise the paid interviews, but I am also interviewing community members, but like kind of like on a case by case basis. So if there's somebody who like you're like, oh, she should definitely talk to this person because they crossed the border for many years, they would like love to be a part of that, you can also put them in touch with me. But anyways, on that note, I'll like conclude